My name's Dr. Stephen Hale. I'm a lecturer in the School of Economics at the University of Adelaide, and I'd like to talk you through a quick guide to modern monetary theory during the coronavirus epidemic. Modern monetary theory is a brand name which has been applied over the last 20 years to an approach to thinking about macroeconomics and the role of the government budget in the economy, which is very different to the mainstream approach, as you'll see. MMT, or modern monetary theory, has been in the news a lot lately, and particularly because of the scale of the challenges facing both the Australian government and governments around the world when it comes to dealing with the inevitable severe recession and the consequences of that recession for people and for businesses and for the short-term and long-term health of our economy as we deal with this terrible pandemic. You might have followed the news over the last couple of weeks about the response of our government to the economic consequences of the coronavirus epidemic and the need to close down or at least reduce the size of large sections of our economy. The rapidly developing economic crisis has led to 3 support packages being announced by our government of a rapidly growing scale, and we may not be finished yet either. The first one was announced on the 12th of March. It was $17.6 billion, including a variety of measures, amongst them one-off cash payments to people on income support and also to small businesses. Then on the 22nd of March, we had the doubling of what used to be called the New Start payment to the unemployed, or what is now known as job seeker payment, and a variety of other measures too, totaling $66 billion. And then just the other day, the government doubled this again with the announcement of a wage subsidy for people in work, or the so-called JobKeeper payment, where they're going to pay $1,500 every 2 weeks to guarantee that people who were in employment on the 1st of March will have at least that income coming to them indirectly from the government via their employers, keeping them in work, keeping them out of unemployment, maintaining an ongoing relationship between them and their employer, and actually keeping them in the workplace where that's possible. People have talked about these packages as though they're stimulus packages, as though it's an old-fashioned Keynesian stimulus to try to prevent the economy from going into recession because of a collapse in demand, or to try and stimulate economic growth. It's neither of those things, really. It's a support package. It's a support package to try and prevent the economy imploding as we try to deal with this once-in-a-century historic global pandemic with which we're faced at the moment. But the question you might ask, and whether you call it a stimulus or not, is how are they going to pay for all this? Or wasn't there supposed to be a debt and deficit disaster? That's what Tony Abbott used to say when he was Prime Minister, and what Malcolm Turnbull used to say when he was Prime Minister, and it's what Scott Morrison said when he was the Treasurer and now as Prime Minister, and it's what Josh Frydenberg has been saying until very recently. Didn't we need to return to surplus? Didn't we need to get the government budget back in the black? If the government's going to spend, what, over $200 billion now, even if our economy doesn't shrink significantly, that's over 10% of our gross domestic product, our national income, in a year. Won't they have to pay all this back? Isn't the government going to suddenly have a lot of debt that it didn't have before? Isn't this going to be a burden on future generations? And what if they can't find the money? Won't it be a crisis? Or is all this spending going to create hyperinflation and wipe out the value of the dollar? Good questions. I'm now going to try and blow your mind. The answer to those questions: no, 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 and probably not. Wasn't there a debt and deficit disaster? No, there never was. Didn't we need to return to surplus? No, actually, it's normal and nothing to be worried about for governments in economies like Australia's economy with a monetary system that works like ours to be running a deficit that allows the rest of us to run surpluses. Won't we have to pay all this back? No, because the government's debt is not debt in the conventional sense of the term. Isn't it a burden on future taxpayers? No. In fact, the Australian government had far more debt than this back in the 1940s. The 1950s, it wasn't a burden on taxpayers then, and it won't be now. Won't it cause a crisis? No, it's actually impossible, the way our monetary system works today, for the Australian government to be faced with a crisis in terms of financing its spending or as a consequence of it running up too much debt. Won't it be inflationary? Probably not. Probably not, because this assistance that the government is providing us with at the moment, although it's on a very large scale, is temporary. And remember, it's not about stimulating an economy that's close to full employment. It's about stopping everything from imploding. Okay. Well, how come it won't be a problem for the government to find the money? If I suddenly had to spend a lot more money, it would be a problem for me. I'd have to find the money by running down my savings, or maybe trying to earn more, or I'd have to borrow. And if I went into debt, it certainly would be a problem. It would be a burden on me in the future, paying back the debt, or I might face a personal financial crisis. I might go bankrupt. But the thing is that I'm a currency user. I'm not a currency issuer. It's not my picture that goes on the currency when we're talking about physical currency. Not that Donald Trump's picture goes on the US currency, but I just couldn't resist putting him on there. I don't sign the notes. Of course, when the government spends these days, yes, they issue currency, but it's electronic currency these days. Of course, it's not principally physical notes and coins. But the fact remains, the government is a currency issuer. You aren't. I'm not. The businesses that your parents work for, maybe that you work for part-time, are not. The local council isn't. The state government isn't. But the federal government is. The federal government is a currency issuer. They're in a completely different position where their finances are concerned to the rest of us. And whatever else you do, when you think about the government's finances, when you think about what we sometimes call fiscal policy, don't think of the government as a household. Don't use that analogy. Don't start thinking about the government running up a tab on its credit card or spending like a drunken sailor, or all those misleading metaphors that you hear people use, because they are misleading. They're basically wrong. The government issues the Australian dollar. It is the monopoly issuer through its central bank, the Reserve Bank of Australia, of the Australian dollar. And so every dollar the government spends is a new dollar. Technically, taxes don't pay for government spending at the federal level. If you could imagine ourselves introducing the Australian dollar now into a society where we hadn't had money before, well, the government could hardly ask us to pay taxes in Australian dollars when there were not any Australian dollars into existence. They'd have to spend some of those dollars into existence before they could take some of them back off us again in taxation, wouldn't they? And that might sound like a silly story, but it gets over an important truth. Governments spend dollars into existence before taxing some of those dollars out of the system again. Every dollar the government spends is a new dollar. Every dollar the government spends is a deposit in our banking system. They then delete some of those dollars later on by raising taxes. So every dollar the government spends is a new dollar. They then tax some of those dollars back. Why do they tax us at all? Well, because if they didn't, there'd be too many dollars in the system. There'd be too much spending in the economy. Given the productive capacity of the economy, there would be accelerating inflation and the dollar would lose its value. So it's necessary for us to pay enough taxes to maintain the value of the dollar and fight inflation. But literally, those taxes can't be seen to fund federal government spending because the federal government is the currency issuer. Every dollar the government spends is a new dollar. They then tax some of those dollars back. The difference we call the fiscal deficit or a government budget deficit. But of course, the government's budget deficit is our surplus. If they take less off us in taxation they've given us in government spending, well, you might say the government's going into the red, but that's us going into the black. The surpluses and deficits, by definition, cancel out. It's a deposit the government is making in the banking system. Now, it matters where those dollars go. It matters if those dollars go to you or to me or some foreign investor or Gina Rinehart. That certainly matters. But there's no problem in funding that expenditure because it's self-funding. All the government has to do is pass a budget or pass a measure through Parliament to authorise it to engage in this spending, and it's then been funded. By definition, the government cannot run out of Australian dollars. It is the issuer of the Australian dollar. So what does the government borrow then? Well, that's complicated, and I don't really want to get into that now, but we've got into the habit of issuing interest-bearing government bonds that fund managers, including the people that are managing the money that your parents have got saved up to go towards their retirement, can invest in to get a nice safe rate of interest. The government doesn't necessarily need to issue those bonds. And indeed, for the last couple of weeks, now that the Reserve Bank has started to practice quantitative easing, where the Reserve Bank, which is owned by the government, is buying up those bonds on the second-hand market, effectively the government isn't at the moment. Effectively, the government is just spending and the RBA is putting funds into the government's bank account. But even under normal circumstances, it isn't the case that the government has to tax or borrow, tax and borrow before it spends. The TABS acronym here does not apply to a government with a monetary system like ours. Instead, the government spends dollars into circulation. They then tax some of those dollars back out of circulation. The difference between what they spend and what they tax is their deficit. And if they wish to do so, and if it's considered to be helpful, given the way that our monetary system works to do so, they can issue bonds to investors to cover the gap between spending and taxation. They're not forced to do so. They're not dependent on bond sales to fund their spending. Oh, sorry, I didn't refer to the cartoon, did I? You get the idea of the cartoon. When people think the government has to tax and borrow before it spends, they're getting the cart before the horse. Let's get the horse before the cart. The government spends dollars into circulation and then it taxes some dollars back out of circulation once more. That's the right way around to think about it. And the government's deficit, as I was just saying, is a non-government surplus. It's a surplus for the rest of us. It's not government deficits which are unsustainable in economies like Australia. It's government surpluses. In the past, when governments have run surpluses, as they did under the Howard Costello government in the early 2000s, it's either driven the private sector into debt, which is what happened then. Household debt trebled, and we now have the second highest level of household debt in the world, or it's weakened private sector balance sheets because a government surplus is just a vacuum cleaner. It's just taking dollars out of the system and push the economy into recession. And that's what happened at the end of the 1980s, the beginning of the 1990s, the last time Australia had a significant recession. What about total government debt? Isn't that something we need to worry about? What about the interest payments on government debt? Well, the government chooses to pay interest to bondholders because it chooses to issue bonds. Those interest payments, like all government spending, are new dollars. They're not being funded out of taxes. They are new dollars, like all federal government spending. And the government's debt in total is nothing to be scared about. It's just the sum total of the dollars that the government has spent into the system, which they've not yet taxed back out of the system. It's not a burden on future generations. Indeed, to the extent that it's held within the domestic private sector, it's a nice safe asset for the private sector to hold so that we have strong balance sheets, so that we can support economic activity without being driven into debt. Governments with their own currencies, so we're not talking about Greece or Italy or Spain here, and floating exchange rates, so we're not talking about the many low and middle income economies that fix their currencies against the US dollar, and no foreign currency debt. we're not talking about places like Argentina, where the government's borrowed lots of US dollars, can never run out of money. Australia has its own currency, the Australian dollar. The Australian dollar has been on a float since 1983. Our government has not promised to exchange its currency for any commodity or any foreign currency at a fixed rate which it can run out of. Our government has no significant foreign currency debt. So our government can never become insolvent. It can never run out of money. It is able to run deficits, allowing the private sector to run surpluses when that is appropriate, and it's highly appropriate in an economy such as the one we have at the moment, which is imploding because of the virus. The constraint on government spending is always the risk of inflation. It's always the productive capacity of the economy. Total government and private spending can never exceed the ability of the private sector to produce goods and services using our labour and skills and capital equipment and technology and infrastructure and institutional capacity and natural resources. And if that should ever be the case, then the consequences of that would be likely to be rising inflation. And under those circumstances, you'd need to either cut back on government spending or raise taxes or do something else. And there's a variety of other things you could do depending on the causes of the inflation in order to bring the rate of inflation back down again. To find out more about this, and all I've given you is a caricature of modern monetary theory, I recommend you watch the Harcourt lecture, which our visiting Harcourt professor, probably the most famous modern monetary theory economist in the world at the moment, Professor Stephanie Kelton, gave in January. Or read her book. It's a brilliant book. I've read it already, although it's not published until June. It's called The Deficit Myth. There's a picture of it on the right. There's a movie coming out at some point in the future called Finding the Money, which is about MMT, which I hope you'll get to see at some point. Or study international financial markets in your first year at the University of Adelaide. I'd love to see you in the classroom where we could discuss some of the things I've been talking about here and look at them in a great deal more detail. Thank you very much.